Somewhere deep in northeastern Russia lies the Tundra, a vast expanse of moss, rocks, and wind, where there are no trees, no roads, and where man is always alone with the endless land. Here, visibility stretches for miles, and any footprint in the snow is like an open book. It would seem impossible to simply disappear in such a place. But it is here that people vanish. Experienced, strong people who know the North better than their own homes. A reindeer herder whose tracks ended on bare rock. A hunter who disappeared 100 steps from his dogs. An elderly woman who stepped behind a cloudberry bush and vanished a few feet from her granddaughter. No signs of a struggle, no animals, no answers. Just a sudden emptiness where a person had been a second ago. Today, you will hear stories from the tundra that few people know about. Stories of people who disappeared so strangely and inexplicably that even the elders dare not speak of them aloud. In the vast northern wilderness, where every trace is visible for miles, 3 experienced strong men who had lived their entire lives amid the frost and wind simply vanished. Their tracks ended on bare rocks, their belongings remained untouched, and their bodies were found where they could not have reached on their own. These are not legends. These are real disappearances that almost no one has heard of, but which are impossible to forget. On 8 October 1997, a 52-year-old reindeer herder named Kevyn disappeared with his herd in the foothills of the Unexplained Range in Chukotka. This story remains one of the most mysterious in the region because not only did the man disappear, but so did 200 reindeer. To understand this story, you need to know a few things about how reindeer herders live in Chukotka. The Chukchi are an indigenous people of the far north of Russia, living on a peninsula directly opposite Alaska, across the Bering Strait. Traditionally, the Chukchi are divided into 2 groups: coastal Chukchi, who hunt marine animals, and reindeer Chukchi, who herd reindeer in the tundra. Kevyn was a reindeer Chukchi. He worked in a reindeer herding brigade, a group of herders who worked together to look after a large herd of reindeer. This is a remnant of the Soviet collective farm system, when reindeer were brought together into large collective farms. Kevyn spent 35 years in the tundra, starting at 17. He was one of the most experienced reindeer herders in the area, a man respected by young herders and whose advice was heeded even by the elders. In early October 1997, Kevyn was herding a herd of 200 reindeer in the foothills of the Unexplained Range at an altitude of about 200 to 600 feet. It was a typical autumn job. The reindeer grazed on the mountain slopes, where green vegetation still remained before winter. Early October in Chukotka marks the first severe frosts, when temperatures drop to -15 to 20 degrees. Still, the polar night has not yet arrived, the period when the sun does not rise above the horizon at all. Kevyn lived alone in a chum, a traditional dwelling of the nomadic peoples of the north, similar to a large conical tent made of deer skins stretched over a wooden frame. Inside the chum, there is a hearth for heating and cooking, a sleeping area made of reindeer skins, and a place to store things. The chum can be dismantled and transported on a sled when the herd moves to a new pasture. On the evening of 7th of October, at about 8 p.m., Kevyn contacted the base camp, which was about 18 miles away, by radio. The base camp is the center of the reindeer herding brigade, where herders' families live, and there is a small school for children, a medical center, and warehouses with supplies. Kevyn reported to the duty officer, "Everything is fine. The herd is calm, the weather is holding, the reindeer grazed all day on the northern slope. Tomorrow I plan to move them a little further east, where I saw good reindeer moss, a lichen that is a staple food of reindeer in winter." The dispatcher recorded the message and scheduled the next communication session for 8 a.m. Such radio communication twice a day is mandatory for lone herders. The tundra does not forgive mistakes, and if something happens, an injury, illness, encounter with a bear, help must arrive quickly. On 8th of October at 8 in the morning, the duty officer turned on the radio and called Kevyn. There was no answer. He tried again 15 minutes later, then again half an hour later. Silence. By 9 in the morning, the team leader had been notified. By noon, 2 search parties on snowmobiles, motorized vehicles for traveling on snow, set out for Kevyn's last known position. The journey took about 2 hours. When the searchers arrived at the campsite, they saw Kevyn's chum, standing as usual on a small hill. They approached. The chum was untouched. They lifted the canopy, the entrance made of reindeer skin, and looked inside. The hearth had cooled, but the ashes showed that the fire had been burning recently, possibly the previous evening or night. The reindeer skin sleeping bag was laid out as if Kevyn had slept in it and gotten up in the morning. His personal belongings, spare clothes, a pot, a cup, some food, were all in their places. The rifle was leaning against the chum's wooden frame. For a reindeer herder, a gun is not just a weapon for hunting, but also protection against wolves and bears that may attack the herd. It was strange that Kevyn had left his rifle behind. An experienced herder never leaves his chum without his weapon. The radio was lying on a small folding table. One of the searchers checked it. The batteries were charged, the radio was working. Why didn't Kevyn answer the morning call? Then the searchers left the chum and began to examine the surroundings. And then they encountered something completely inexplicable. The herd had disappeared. 200 reindeer, the entire herd that Kevyn had been herding, had vanished completely. To understand how strange this is, you need to know that 200 reindeer is not a small group of animals. An adult reindeer weighs about 220–330 pounds. A herd of 200 reindeer covers an area of several hectares when grazing. When such a herd moves, it leaves clear traces. Hundreds of hooves trample the snow, break branches, and leave droppings. The searchers began to circle the area around the chum, expanding the radius. They were looking for traces of the herd. The snow on the ground was thin, about 2 inches deep, enough to see the tracks clearly. There were traces of Kevyn himself, prints of his muklux, traditional fur boots made of deer skin with fur inside, around the chum, to the place where the deer usually stood. There were isolated traces of several deer. Apparently, they had grazed near the chum yesterday, but there were no traces of mass movement. There was no wide strip of trampled snow, trampled earth, broken vegetation that always remains when a herd of 200 reindeer moves from one place to another. It was as if 200 reindeer had vanished into thin air. One of the searchers, an elderly herder named Renatigan, said, "That can't be. Even if the herd was frightened by wolves, a bear, and ran, there would be tracks everywhere. Panicked deer run in different directions, leaving tracks in all directions. There's nothing here." Then they found Kevyn's own tracks. His boot prints led from the chum about 1,000 feet east to a rocky ridge, where large boulders protruded from the ground. The searchers followed the tracks. Step by step, the trail was clear in the thin snow. Kevyn was clearly walking calmly, not running. The distance between the footprints was normal for walking. At the rocky ridge, the tracks came to a large flat rock, and on this rock, the tracks ended. Nothing further. The searchers walked around the rock and checked the area within a 160-foot radius. There were no other tracks. It was as if Kevyn had stepped onto the rock and disappeared. By evening, an expanded search party had arrived. 20 people, including the best trackers from several teams. They began a systematic search. They checked every crevice between the rocks. Perhaps Kevyn had fallen into a crack. They checked the slopes around. Maybe he had slipped and fallen. They shouted his name. The Tundra responded only with echoes and the howling wind. The next day, an Mi-8 helicopter was called in. A large Soviet helicopter used in the north for transport and search and rescue operations. The helicopter flew over an area within a 30-mile radius of the chum, with pilots and observers looking for any signs. A person, a herd of reindeer, tracks in the snow. Nothing was found. The search continued for a week. More than 50 people combed the mountains and tundra. They used all their knowledge of the area and all their tracking skills. but neither Kevyn nor his herd were found. 19 days after the disappearance, a group of hunters checking fox traps about 37 miles from Kevyn's chum discovered a group of reindeer. Looking closely, they saw marks on their ears. Each reindeer in a reindeer herding brigade has a special mark carved on its ear to identify which brigade it belongs to. These were Kevyn's reindeer. The hunters counted 47 reindeer. The animals were scattered over a large area, grazing in separate groups of 5 to 10. They looked frightened and nervous, keeping their distance from people. Usually, domestic reindeer are relatively calm around herders, but these ones shied away and ran off. Over the next few weeks, several more groups of deer from Kevyn's herd were found. A total of about 80 animals scattered over a vast area within a 60-mile radius of the chum. The remaining 153 deer were never found. Winter came to Chukotka. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees Celsius. Snowstorms began. The search for Kevyn was suspended until spring. His wife and adult children refused to believe that he was dead. A reindeer herder with 35 years of experience could not simply disappear. In March 1988, 5 months after his disappearance, a group of hunters made their spring rounds of the territory, checking on how the wild animals had survived the winter. 17 miles from Kevyn's chum, on a hillside, they saw something dark in the snow. As they got closer, they realized it was a human body. It was Kevyn. The body was lying in the snow on the slope, partially covered by snowdrifts. Nearby, neatly stacked, lay all of his traditional clothing. To understand how strange this is, it is necessary to describe what traditional Chukchi clothing for reindeer herders looks like. A kuchlianka is a long fur coat made of reindeer skin with the fur on the inside, reaching to the knees with a hood. Another kuchlianka is often worn over it with the fur on the outside. Fur pants made of reindeer skin. Unti are tall fur boots with walrus leather soles, lined with fur and grass for warmth. For mittens. This clothing was created over centuries specifically for survival in the Arctic climate, where winter temperatures drop to 49 degrees Fahrenheit. All of these clothes were removed from Kevyn and neatly folded next to his body. The kulyanka was folded, the pants were laid separately, and the unta boots stood next to them in pairs. It looked as if the man had methodically and calmly undressed and folded his clothes. Kevyn was lying in his underwear. His body was frozen, covered with snow and ice. The hunters immediately notified the authorities. The body was taken to the district center for examination. The forensic expert determined the cause of death to be hypothermia. There was no doubt about that. But the expert could not answer the central question. Why would an experienced reindeer herder who had lived in the Arctic all his life and knew all the signs and dangers of hypothermia undress in the tundra at a temperature of 31 degrees Celsius? There is a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, the final stage of severe hypothermia, when the peripheral blood vessels suddenly dilate, sending a rush of warm blood to the extremities. This creates a false sense of intense heat, and the person dying of cold begins to feel unbearably hot and removes their clothing. This is a well-documented medical phenomenon. But the question was, how did Kevyn end up in a state of severe hypothermia in the first place? He had all the necessary clothing. He knew the tundra. He had a chum with a warm hearth only 17 miles away. Why didn't he return there? The village elders gathered at the Kevyn family home to discuss the matter. In Chukchi culture, elders are not just old people. They are the keepers of traditional knowledge, those who remember old stories, understand the laws of the tundra, and know how to communicate with spirits. The oldest of them, a 76-year-old reindeer herder named Tynatval, who still remembered the days before Soviet rule, said, "I saw something like this once when I was young. A herder disappeared along with his herd. They found him a month away from the camp, naked. The elders said then that the spirits of the tundra had taken him. When the spirits call, a person must go. He cannot resist. They lead him where they need him. They take the warmth from his body. They take his mind. In the end, He undresses because he feels fire inside, even though he is freezing. For many residents of the village, this explanation made sense. In traditional Chukchi cosmology, the tundra is inhabited by spirits. Spirits of the wind, spirits of stones, spirits of reindeer, spirits of ancestors. These spirits can be benevolent, but they can also be dangerous. They have their own laws, their own desires. Sometimes they take people away, but some sought a rational explanation. Perhaps Kevyn had suffered a head injury. He fell, hit his head, and got a concussion. In a state of confusion, he began to wander in the wrong direction, got lost, and froze to death. That would explain his death, but it didn't explain the disappearance of the herd and the strange break in the tracks at the rocks. Maybe the herd was frightened by something, a pack of wolves, a bear, and scattered in all directions. Kevyn ran after them, trying to gather the herd, wandered far away, and got lost. But that did not explain why there were no traces of the reindeer's panicked flight. Kevyn's story became another in a long line of mysterious disappearances in the Arctic. In these places, where man borders on the limits of survival, where nature shows its absolute power, things sometimes happen that cannot be explained rationally. On 15th of March 1992, a 38-year-old Chukchi hunter named Tynatval left the village of Lavrentia in Chukotka to check his walrus traps in the coastal tundra about 5 miles from home. Early March in these parts is when the polar day is just beginning to return after the long winter darkness. However, the temperature still hovers around 13 degrees Celsius. Tynatval was no novice. He had been hunting in these parts for more than 20 years, following in his father's and grandfather's footsteps along the ancient roots of his people since his youth. He knew every rock, every bend in the coastline, every dangerous spot on the ice, as well as he knew his own home. The village elders spoke of him as one of the most experienced hunters. That morning, Tynatval told his wife he would be back by evening. He harnessed a team of 5 Leica dogs, all trained, experienced animals that had traveled hundreds of miles with him across the Arctic wilderness. He loaded everything he needed onto the sled: a rifle, a supply of dried meat and bread, a thermos of hot tea, knives, ropes. He was dressed in traditional Chukchi clothing, a deerskin coat, fur pants, and boots, clothing that had saved his people from the Arctic cold for centuries. When midnight came and Tynatval had not returned, his wife became worried. In the tundra, people don't just arrive late. A delay could mean trouble, broken sleds, injury, or an encounter with a bear. She woke up the neighbors. At dawn, a group of men from the village set out on snowmobiles to search for him. About 7 miles from the village, farther than expected, they found his sled. The scene they witnessed frightened even these hardened hunters. All 5 dogs were tied to a large rock, alive but in a state of absolute panic. They howled, tugged at the harness, and tried to break free. Their eyes were filled with fear. The sled was untouched. All of Tynatval's belongings were in place. The rifle was in its case, the thermos with tea was on the sled, and the food was packed. But the hunter himself was gone. The men began to search for tracks. Tynatval's boot prints were clearly visible in the snow, leading from the sled to a group of large boulders about 330 feet to the north. They followed the tracks. Step by step, the trail led across the open tundra to the boulders. Then, on completely flat, open snow, the tracks abruptly ended. There was nothing else. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, no animal tracks. Just the last footprint of a boot in the snow. And that was it. It was as if Tynatval had been lifted into the air. The hunters checked the wind that night. There was practically none. A light breeze could not have covered the tracks so quickly in open terrain. They examined the snow around them. It was dense, compacted, ideal for preserving tracks. If Tynatval had continued walking, the prints would have been visible, but they were not there. By evening of the same day, the search party had grown to 40 people, all experienced hunters from Lavrentia and neighboring villages. They combed the tundra in circles, spreading out from the place where the tracks ended. They checked every hollow, every pile of stones, every crack in the ice. They shouted Tynatval's name. Only the wind answered them. The search continued for 5 days. The men worked from dawn to dusk, some staying overnight in the tundra so as not to waste time returning to the village. They used all their knowledge of the area and all their hunting skills. But Tynatval seemed to have vanished into thin air. 2 weeks after his disappearance, a group of hunters checking traps on the shore of the Bering Strait made a terrible discovery. 22 miles from the place where Tynatval disappeared, almost in the opposite direction from the village, a body lay among the ice ridges. It was Tynatval. The body was partially frozen and covered with frost. He was lying on his side between chunks of ice, as if he had lain down to rest and never got up. When the hunters came closer, they noticed some strange things that made no sense. His boots were missing. Tynatval's feet were bare. But when they examined his feet, they found that the skin on them was almost undamaged. There were a few scratches, slight signs of frostbite, but nothing serious. There were no deep cuts, no severe frostbite, none of the terrible tissue damage that should have been there if a person had walked 22 miles barefoot across the icy tundra at a temperature of 13 degrees. All of his traditional fur clothing, his coat, his pants, was on him, but they were unfastened. The kuchlanka hung open. The pants were untied. In such a state, in the Arctic cold, a person freezes in hours, if not faster. The body was taken to the village. There were no signs of violent death, no knife or bullet wounds. There were no signs of a bear or other predator attack. The cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. But how? How could an experienced hunter who had lived in the Arctic all his life and knew all the signs of hypothermia unbutton his clothes in the deadly cold? How did he end up 22 miles away from his sled, in the opposite direction? Why didn't he return to the sled, where his dogs, supplies, and rifle were? And most mysterious of all, why did his feet look as if he had hardly walked at all? Investigators from the district center sought a rational explanation. Perhaps Tynatval was struck on the head by a falling rock, causing concussion and disorientation. In a confused state of mind, he went in the wrong direction, was carried away by the wind, froze, and experienced paradoxical undressing in the final stage of hypothermia. But this version did not explain the condition of his feet. If he walked 22 miles, even in boots, let alone barefoot, his feet would have been destroyed. And where did the shoes go? And why did the tracks end so strangely at the boulders? The village elders did not seek rational explanations. They gathered at Tynatval's house and performed a traditional ritual. The oldest among them, an 80-year-old hunter named Vuntigan, said, "The spirits of the tundra took him. He broke something, or his time came. The tundra takes those it chooses. We cannot know its laws." Tynatval's wife said that a few days before his disappearance, her husband had talked about strange dreams. He dreamed of a white fox calling him to the north, to the sea. In Chukchi tradition, the white fox is a messenger of the spirits. A dream about it can be an omen. Tynatval's story became another in a long line of unexplained disappearances in the Arctic. Local residents know that the tundra does not forgive mistakes, but sometimes it takes even those who have done nothing wrong. It takes them according to its own laws, which humans do not understand. 33 years have passed since that March day. Tynatval would now be 71 years old. His children have grown up and become hunters like their father. They avoid the place where his tracks ended. They say that dogs still refuse to go there, whining and resisting. In the village of Lavrentia, they remember Tynatval as a good hunter and a good man, and they remember his disappearance as a reminder. The tundra is not just land. It is a living space with its own spirits and its own rules. and sometimes it takes those it deems necessary. Another disappearance that defies logic and common sense occurred in the late 1980s on the outskirts of Russia's northernmost city, Pevek, in Chukotka. An elderly Eskimo woman named Irguvye lived there. Everyone knew her. Quiet, stubborn, resilient, with hands permanently stained by berry juice and fish. She was 64 years old and had been picking berries in the tundra longer than many in the village had been alive. More than 50 years. On 22nd August 1989, there was a warm day, rare for those parts. The Arctic summer was almost over. The grass was turning yellow, the moss was darkening, and the hills were beginning to take on an autumnal redness. But on that day, it was about 8 degrees Celsius. Windless, damp, but comfortably northern. For the locals, it was almost a luxury, a day when you could go out into the tundra without fear of freezing. In the morning, Irguvye called her granddaughter, a 12-year-old girl named Unamtuk, to come with her. They often went to the tundra together to pick berries. Cloudberries and blueberries were not just a treat, but an essential part of their winter diet. Cloudberries are low-growing, amber-colored marsh berries, highly prized in the north, similar to northern raspberries but growing in the tundra. Blueberries are familiar to many, but in Chukotka, they are denser, more sour, and survive in the cold. The berry patches were about 3 miles from the village. For the residents of Pevek, this is not a long distance, especially in summer when there are no blizzards or polar nights. They walked leisurely across the tundra. Irguvye walked with a confident, familiar gait, while Unamtuk was constantly distracted by the cries of birds, strange flowers, and fox tracks on the wet moss. By noon, they reached a small tundra stream. In places like this, the water is icy, even in summer. Melting snow and underground springs feed it year-round. Irguvye suggested they take a break. Let's sit down, rest, and then fill the basket. Winter is long. They sat down on a flat rock by the water, drank tea from a thermos, and ate crackers. After a few minutes, Irguvye got up and said to her granddaughter, "Sit here and rest. I'll be right there." And she pointed to a small hillock, a low hill a few dozen feet away. At its foot grew thick bushes. There, according to her, there were always good cloudberries. Unamtuk remained on the rock. From there, she could see her grandmother perfectly, a figure in a dark jacket with a kerchief on her head, walking toward the bushes, bending down and starting to pick berries. The sound of the quiet splashing of the stream, the occasional cries of birds, the distant hum of the wind, everything was familiar and peaceful. Several minutes passed. Unamtuk later said that time seemed to stand still. She sat, looked around, and thought about something of her own. Suddenly, in the silence of the tundra, she heard a strange sound, a high, drawn-out whistle that she had never heard before. It was unlike the cry of a bird or the sound of the wind in the rocks. It seemed to be coming from that very hill. The girl shuddered and turned to where she had seen her grandmother a second ago. She realized that Irguvye had disappeared. There was no one where she had just been standing. Unamtuk jumped up and ran to the bushes. The ground was slightly damp, but not swampy, so it was easy to walk on. Near the bushes, she saw her grandmother's basket, half full of cloudberries and blueberries. The basket was lying on its side, and a few berries had rolled out onto the moss, but Irguvye herself was nowhere to be seen. The girl began to shout, "Ba! Ba! Where are you?" Silence. The tundra was silent. There was no sound of footsteps, no crackling of branches, no answer. She ran around the bushes, looked behind the rocks, and climbed a little higher up the slope of the hill. No traces, no figures in the distance. Just the same flat expanse of moss and lichen, soft hills, and scattered rocks. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then half an hour. All she had with her was a small knife and a mug. Unamtuk was 12, But like all children of the North, she understood that the tundra was no place to play. Time passed, and her grandmother did not respond. She began to feel afraid. Finally, she made a life-or-death decision: to leave the basket, memorize the location, and run to the village for help. She knew the way. They had come here along the same route. The girl ran, sometimes breaking into a fast pace, trying not to lose her direction. Her heart was pounding in her throat, and her legs were buckling from fear and fatigue. After about an hour, she reached Pevek. Out of breath and in tears, she rushed into her family's house and incoherently recounted what had happened. "We were by the stream. Grandma went to the hill. There was a whistle. I looked back. She was gone. Only the basket was left." In a small village of about 60 people, news like this spreads quickly. Half an hour later, almost the entire community was ready to go to the tundra. The men took guns in case they encountered a bear, and the women took warm clothes, food, and radios. A line of people went out into the tundra. They took Nunamtuk with them to show them the exact location. They walked quickly but cautiously. By the time they reached the stream, the day was drawing to a close. The Arctic sun was beginning to sink lower, and the shadows were lengthening. They found Irguvye's basket where her granddaughter had said it would be. The berries in it had dried slightly in the sun. Around it were the small footprints of Nunamtuk and the larger footprints of Irguvye. The old men crouched down and scrutinized the ground and moss. Irguvye's footprints led from the place where the basket lay to a group of large boulders at the foot of the hill, about 160 feet away. The footprints were clear. The elderly woman had walked at a normal pace, without rushing or running. They followed the footprints to the rocks. And then, nothing. The rocks were dry, covered with lichen in places. Not a drop of blood, no signs of a struggle, no torn fabric. If she had stumbled and fallen, there should have been something: a skid mark, broken moss, snags. But here, everything was untouched. It was as if she had reached these boulders and vanished into thin air. The search continued for 11 days. People combed the tundra in circles, expanding the radius each day. There were no helicopters near the village. These were harsh years when equipment broke down and fuel was rationed. People walked, drove old cars, and used rare all-terrain vehicles. At night, the temperature dropped to 32 degrees, and during the day it stayed around 41 degrees. For a person in warm clothes, this is not fatal. Irguvye was dressed in warm traditional clothing: a fur vest, a jacket, a thick skirt, and traditional shoes called torbasa. Torbasa are fur shoes made of deer skin with soft soles, warm and comfortable for walking on the tundra. In the early days, people believed they would find her alive. She could have gotten lost. Her legs could have given out. She could have fallen and injured her arm. But she had half a century of survival experience. She knew how to wait out the night, how to shelter from the wind, how to build a small fire from dwarf birch and dry moss. But the days passed, and the tundra remained empty. No new tracks, no leftover fires, no pieces of clothing, nothing. 3 weeks later, when hope was almost gone, a group of hunters returning from a more remote area noticed a strange, bright spot in the distance on the slope of a low mountain. They approached and froze. At an altitude of about 2,000 feet, on a flat rock in the middle of an almost bare slope, lay the body of a woman. It was Irguvye. She was lying on her back, her arms neatly folded across her chest, as if she had been deliberately placed there, as the dead are laid out before a ceremony. Her face was calm, her eyes closed. The strangest thing was in the details. She was not wearing torbas, shoes. Her feet were bare, but her feet were clean, with no serious injuries. A few minor scratches, slightly reddened skin, but no deep cracks from the cold, no scraped areas, no signs of long walks on rocks and moss. In those days, the temperature did not drop below 32 degrees Celsius. Yes, for an unaccustomed person, +2 or +3 with the wind could be dangerous, But for a local woman dressed in traditional clothing, it was a normal end to summer. However, the doctor who examined the body would later say, "The cause of death was hypothermia. That is, she died from the cold, even though the weather was far from winter. There were almost no belongings near the body, no basket, no thermos, no small items. She was wearing clothes, but they were slightly open, as if she had become hot. This is similar to the final stage of hypothermia, when a person dying from the cold feels unbearable heat. But the main question on everyone's mind in the village was different. How did she end up there? From the place where Irguvye disappeared to the point where her body was found, it was about 11 miles in a straight line and high up in the mountains. For a young, fit woman, it would have been a challenging but possible journey in a few days. For a 64-year-old woman, even when accustomed to the tundra, it was almost impossible. Especially barefoot, as if she had taken off her shoes long before her death, yet her feet remained virtually intact. After the funeral, the old people in the village spoke quietly so that the children would not hear. It was not just the wind, it was a call. For the northern peoples, the tundra is alive. It is home to spirits, the spirits of the hills, rivers, stones, and wind. Sometimes they are heard as strange sounds, whistles, hums, whispers. To answer this call means to go where there is no return. Nunamtuk, now a grown woman, recalled that day, saying, "I often think, if it weren't for that whistle, if I hadn't been distracted, could I have changed anything? I saw her, and then I just didn't see her. It was as if someone had turned off the picture." She still sometimes dreams of her grandmother standing by the bushes with a basket, and that thin whistle that sends shivers down her spine. Irguvye's disappearance was a reminder to Pevik that even on a warm August day, the tundra remains a place where humans are guests, not masters. And sometimes it takes away those who have walked on it all their lives, as easily as if it were closing an invisible door behind them.